2 hours before Dean Martin's final appearance on The Tonight Show, he sat alone in his dressing room at NBC's Burbank studio. The makeup artist had already left. The wardrobe assistant had confirmed his suit. The production assistant had knocked twice to say Johnny was ready whenever he was. But Dean Martin wasn't moving. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, ringed with bulbs that had illuminated 1,000 faces before his. The light was harsh, clinical. It showed everything: the lines around his eyes, the gray beneath the dye, the weight of 65 years compressed into the face of a man who had spent 4 decades convincing America he never worried about anything. Outside his door, Studio One hummed with the mechanical efficiency of live television. Cameras rolled into position. Microphones descended from the ceiling like mechanical insects. The audience filed in, already laughing at jokes that hadn't been told yet, primed for entertainment, expecting the Dean Martin they had always known. The man in the dressing room was not that person anymore. This was May 1982. Ronald Reagan occupied the White House. MTV had launched 9 months earlier. The world Dean Martin had helped build, the Rat Pack Vegas, the cigarette-sponsored variety shows, the bourbon-soaked cool that defined masculinity for an entire generation, was dissolving into history. And Dean Martin, who had never asked for permission to do anything in his life, was about to ask for something he couldn't name. Johnny Carson had noticed it 3 weeks earlier. They were on the phone, a rare occurrence, because Dean hated phones the way other men hate failure, and Johnny asked him about doing one more show. Just one. A proper goodbye to the audience who had watched him grow from a young crooner in 1962 to whatever he was now in the spring of Reagan's America. Dean had said yes immediately, too immediately. Johnny Carson, who had built a career on reading the spaces between words, heard something in that quickness, an eagerness that didn't match the man. Dean Martin never rushed toward anything. He ambled, he drifted, he arrived late and left early, and made both seem like the only reasonable way to exist. But that yes on the phone had been fast, almost desperate. Johnny didn't mention it. He thanked Dean, confirmed the date with his producer, and hung up. Then he sat in his Malibu home office, staring at the Pacific Ocean through floor-to-ceiling windows, and felt the first cold thread of worry work its way into his chest. Something was wrong. He couldn't identify it, couldn't point to evidence. But after 20 years of sitting across from America's most guarded performer, Johnny had developed an instinct for Dean Martin's silences. And this one, transmitted through phone lines and confirmed by that too-quick yes, felt different. It felt like an ending. The Tonight Show stage in 1982 existed in a permanent state of controlled chaos. 3 cameras on wheels, boom microphones hovering like the suspended breath of a waiting crowd, the famous rainbow curtain backdrop that had become as iconic as Johnny's desk, Doc Severinsen and his band occupying the right side of the stage, instruments gleaming under lights hot enough to make the air shimmer. The audience sat in tiered rows, faces lost in shadow beyond the first 3 rows. NBC used a lighting design that made the stage feel like an island, everything illuminated, everything beyond it dark. It created intimacy in a room that held 300 people. It made millions watching at home feel like they were part of a private conversation. Tonight, that illusion would become truth. Dean Martin walked onto the stage at 5:47 p.m. Pacific time. The band hit his cue, Everybody Loves Somebody, and the audience erupted. They always did. Dean Martin entrances had triggered Pavlovian applause for 2 decades. He was America's uncle, America's drinking buddy, America's reminder that life didn't have to be taken seriously. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored. His tie was silver. His hair was perfect, too perfect, the way it had been since the mid-70s, when vanity began winning its quiet war against authenticity. He smiled. The smile was flawless, practiced. The same smile he had deployed in 1962, 1967, 1974, and every appearance between. The smile that said, "I'm delighted to be here, but I could leave at any moment and be equally delighted elsewhere." Johnny Carson, sitting behind his desk with his hands folded, watched Dean cross the stage. And he saw it. Not the smile, the effort required to maintain it. They shook hands. The audience was still applauding. Dean settled into the chair beside Johnny's desk. The guest chair, the most famous seat in American television, where presidents and poets and movie stars had sat to be seen and heard and occasionally understood. Dean crossed his legs, adjusted his jacket, looked at Johnny with an expression of relaxed amusement. "Good to see you, Pally," Dean said. His voice was the same, that low, warm instrument that had sold 100 million records. But Johnny heard something beneath it, a thinness, like ice over water that's too deep. "Good to have you back, Dean," Johnny said. "It's been too long." "Well, you know me," Dean said. "I don't like to overstay my welcome." The audience laughed. They always laughed at Dean's self-deprecation. It was part of the contract. Dean pretended he didn't care, and America loved him for it. But Johnny wasn't laughing. He was watching Dean's hands. Dean Martin's hands had always been steady. Steady when he held a microphone. Steady when he held a prop drink on his variety show. Steady when he lit cigarettes on stage, a gesture so smooth it looked choreographed. Tonight his right hand was resting on the arm of the chair, and it was trembling, not violently, not enough for cameras to catch. But Johnny saw it, a small, involuntary shake that Dean was trying to control by pressing his palm flat against the upholstery. Johnny's throat went dry. The interview began the way Tonight Show interviews always began. Johnny asked about Dean's golf game. Dean made a joke about his handicap being his partner. The audience laughed. Doc Severinsen played a musical sting. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. Dean's responses were coming half a second too slow, not enough to disrupt the rhythm, not enough for the audience to notice. But Johnny Carson had conducted 17,000 interviews. He knew the tempo of conversation the way a jazz musician knows time signatures. And Dean Martin, who had always matched Johnny's pace perfectly, who had always known exactly when to land a punchline, was off. Just slightly. Just enough. "You been working much?" Johnny asked. Standard question. Easy territory. Dean smiled. "You know me, Johnny. I work when they make me." Laugh, applause, normal. But Dean's eyes weren't focused on Johnny anymore. They were focused somewhere past the cameras, past the audience, past the studio walls, focused on something only Dean Martin could see. Johnny felt his chest tighten. "Dean," he said, and his voice shifted, lower, quieter. The voice he used when interviews stopped being performances and became conversations. "You doing okay?" The audience went quiet. Not silent. Audiences are never truly silent. There's always the rustle of fabric, the clearing of throats, the ambient sound of 300 people breathing. But quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something real intrudes on entertainment. Dean looked at Johnny. For 3 seconds he didn't smile. For 3 seconds the mask slipped. And in those 3 seconds, Johnny Carson saw his friend. Not Dean Martin the performer. Not Dean Martin the legend. Not Dean Martin the man who had sung "That's Amore" to President Kennedy and played drunk for a television generation. He saw Dino Crocetti from Steubenville, Ohio, a 65-year-old man who was tired, who had been tired for years, who had smiled through the death of his son and the collapse of his marriages and the slow extinction of the world that had made him famous, who was sitting on national television 2 hours into what would be his final Tonight Show appearance and couldn't pretend anymore. "I'm fine, Pally," Dean said finally. The smile returned, but it was too late. Johnny had seen the truth. During the commercial break, Johnny Carson did something he had never done in 20 years of hosting The Tonight Show. He stood up from behind his desk, walked over to Dean Martin's chair, and knelt beside it. The crew froze. Producers don't kneel. Hosts don't leave their positions. The architecture of television is built on spatial relationships. Host behind desk, guest in chair, band to the right, audience in shadow. You don't violate that geometry. You don't break the fourth wall from the inside. But Johnny Carson was on his knees beside Dean Martin's chair, and his hand was on Dean's arm, and his voice was too low for microphones to catch. "What's going on?" Johnny said. Dean looked at him. The studio lights were still burning. Makeup assistants were checking powder. Camera operators were adjusting lenses. In 90 seconds, they would be live again. "I'm tired, John," Dean said. Not Johnny, John. That was the name Dean used in private. In Las Vegas hotel rooms at 4 in the morning, in phone calls after funerals, in the spaces between public and private where two men who had built careers on never revealing anything could sometimes tell the truth. "Tired how?" Johnny asked. Dean smiled, the real smile this time, small, sad. The smile of a man who has carried something heavy for so long, he's forgotten what it feels like to put it down. All of it, Dean said. 60 seconds to air. Johnny squeezed Dean's arm, stood, walked back to his desk, sat down, arranged his notes, became Johnny Carson again. But something had changed. When the cameras came back on, Johnny Carson's face was different. The second segment of the interview should have been lighter. That was the structure. First segment, catch up, establish rapport, get comfortable. Second segment, tell stories, make jokes, remind America why they loved you. Third segment, plug the project, say goodbye, exit to applause. Dean Martin had followed this structure 45 times before. Tonight he couldn't. Tell us about the old days, Johnny said. The Sands, the Copa Room, you and Frank. Dean shifted in his chair. That was a long time ago, Johnny. Best times though, right? I don't know if they were the best times, Dean said slowly. They were the times we had. The audience didn't know how to respond. That wasn't a punchline. That was something else. Johnny leaned forward. What do you mean? Dean looked at his hands. The tremor was still there. He didn't try to hide it anymore. You do something long enough, Dean said. You forget why you started. You forget what it was supposed to feel like. You just keep doing it because everyone expects you to. The studio was completely quiet now. I played a character my whole life, Dean said. The drunk, the guy who doesn't care. The guy who shows up late and leaves early and thinks everything's a joke. He looked directly at Johnny. But I cared, John. I cared about all of it. Every song, every show, every time I walked on stage and pretended it didn't matter. It mattered. It all mattered. Johnny Carson's eyes were wet. The cameras caught it. Millions of Americans watching at home saw Johnny Carson, who never cried on television, fighting tears. Why didn't you say that before? Johnny asked quietly. Because that wasn't the job, Dean said. The job was to make people feel good, to make them think life was easy, that you could drink and smoke and joke your way through anything. He smiled, that sad, small smile. But life isn't easy, Johnny, and I'm tired of pretending it is. The third segment never happened. There was no plug, no project to promote. Dean Martin hadn't worked in 6 months, hadn't wanted to work, hadn't been able to summon the energy required to become Dean Martin one more time. Instead, Johnny Carson and Dean Martin sat on that stage for 18 minutes. They talked about Dino, Dean's son, who had died in a plane crash in 1987, 5 years in Dean's future, but already haunting him with the premonition that comes to fathers who love their children and know the world is cruel. They talked about the nights in Vegas when success felt like prison. They talked about what it cost to be beloved. The audience didn't laugh. They watched. They watched two men who had built careers on deflection and humor and carefully managed images talk about loneliness, about aging, about the violence of being seen by millions and understood by no one. The producers didn't cut to commercial. Fred de Cordova, the Tonight Show's executive producer, stood in the control room watching monitors, and when his assistant asked if they should break, Fred shook his head. "Let it run," he said. So America watched. They watched Dean Martin, who had spent 40 years performing ease, admit he had never felt easy. They watched Johnny Carson, who had spent 20 years asking questions, stop asking and start listening. And somewhere in that 18 minutes, television stopped being entertainment and became witness. When it ended, and it did end, because all performances end, even the real ones, Dean Martin stood up. The audience began to applaud, but Johnny raised his hand. "Wait," he said. The applause stopped. Johnny stood, walked around his desk, stood in front of Dean Martin on national television, in front of 300 people and 12 million viewers, and hugged him. Dean Martin, who had spent a lifetime avoiding genuine emotion, who had built an empire on detachment, who had sung love songs without ever seeming vulnerable, Dean Martin hugged Johnny Carson back. The cameras held the shot. No one spoke. Doc Severinsen didn't play. The audience didn't make a sound. The crew in the rafters, men who had seen 1,000 celebrity appearances, stood frozen. For 37 seconds, two men held each other on the most famous stage in America. And then Dean Martin let go. He stepped back, adjusted his jacket, found his smile, the real one this time, small and sad and true. "Thanks, Pally," he said. Johnny nodded. His face was wet. He didn't wipe it. Dean Martin walked off the stage. He didn't wave, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the applause that finally, hesitatingly, began to build. He walked through the rainbow curtain and disappeared. Johnny Carson stood alone on the stage for a moment. Then he walked back to his desk, sat down, looked at the camera. "We'll be right back," he said. His voice was steady, professional, the voice of a man who had ended 10,000 shows and would end 10,000 more. But everyone watching knew. That wasn't an ending, that was a goodbye. After the show, after the audience had filed out and the crew had begun breaking down equipment, Johnny Carson went to Dean Martin's dressing room. The door was open. Dean was sitting in the same chair in front of the same mirror, under the same harsh lights. He was still in his suit. He hadn't moved. Johnny stood in the doorway. "You okay?" he asked. Dean looked at Johnny's reflection in the mirror. "I needed to say it," Dean said. "I needed someone to know what?" Dean smiled, the last real smile Johnny would see. "That it wasn't all an act," Dean said. "That somewhere under the character there was a person. And that person tried. He really tried." Johnny walked into the room, sat in the chair beside Dean's. They stared at their reflections together, two men in expensive suits under studio lights, looking older than they felt, younger than they looked. "I know," Johnny said. Dean nodded. They sat in silence for 11 minutes. Then Dean stood, shook Johnny's hand, walked out of the dressing room, out of the studio, out of NBC Burbank. He would never return. Dean Martin made one more television appearance after that night, a brief spot on a charity special in 1983, but he never performed again. Not really. The man who had walked off the Tonight Show stage in May 1982 had left something behind in that 18-minute conversation, the energy required to be Dean Martin, the will to maintain the illusion. He spent his final years in relative isolation, playing golf, watching television, sitting in his home on Mountain Drive in Beverly Hills, looking out at a city that had once treated him like royalty and now barely remembered he existed. Johnny Carson tried calling, once a month at first, then every few months, then once a year. Dean rarely answered, but in 1995, 2 months before Dean died, Johnny called one last time. Dean picked up. "Hey, Pally," Dean said. His voice was thin, decades of cigarettes and silence. "I was thinking about that night," Johnny said, "the last show." "Yeah? You knew, didn't you? You knew it was the last time." Dean was quiet for a moment. "I knew," he said. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have tried to stop me," Dean said. "You would have asked me to come back, to do one more show, one more appearance. And I couldn't, John. I didn't have it anymore." Johnny's throat was tight. "Did it help?" Johnny asked. "Saying it, telling the truth?" Dean Martin, dying in a house full of gold records and photographs of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else, smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it helped." Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995. Johnny Carson sent flowers to the funeral. He didn't attend. He couldn't. The grief was too private, and Johnny Carson had spent 30 years keeping private things private. But that night, alone in his Malibu home, Johnny Carson watched a recording of that final Tonight Show appearance. He watched Dean walk on stage, watched the smile, watched the tremor in his hands, watched 18 minutes of truth break through 40 years of performance. And he watched himself kneel beside Dean's chair during a commercial break and heard his own voice, captured accidentally by a hot microphone, ask, "What's going on?" He heard Dean's response, "I'm tired, John." Johnny rewound the tape, watched it again and again, not because he had forgotten, but because he wanted to remember. He wanted to remember that beneath every performance is a person, that fame is a costume, that the bravest thing a man can do is admit he's tired of pretending. The Tonight Show aired that final Dean Martin appearance on May 24, 1982. 12 million people watched. Reviews the next day called it surprisingly emotional and unexpectedly raw. Critics noted that Dean Martin seemed reflective and uncharacteristically serious. But no one mentioned what really happened. No one wrote about the 18 minutes when television stopped being entertainment and became confession. No one analyzed the moment when Dean Martin, who had spent a lifetime hiding, chose to be seen. Because most people weren't looking for that. They were looking for Dean Martin, the performer, the character, the drunk who wasn't really drunk, the playboy who wasn't really playing. They weren't looking for Dino Crocetti from Steubenville, Ohio, the man who was tired, The man who needed someone to know he had tried. The man who, 2 hours before his final Tonight Show appearance, sat alone in a dressing room and decided to stop pretending. There are 46 recordings of Dean Martin on The Tonight Show in NBC's archives. 45 of them show a man in complete control, a master of performance, a professional who knew exactly how to make America love him. One shows something different. One shows a man who loved America back and who needed to say goodbye.